Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where crowns are heavy, rebellions are frequent, and kings themselves sometimes find their faces stamped with the medieval version of a wanted poster. Imagine you're trudging down a muddy road in 14th century England, rain dripping from your cloak, when you hear whispers at a tavern door, the king has been overthrown, or worse, declared a traitor. That's right, monarchs could end up fugitives too. You probably won't survive this little trek through backstabbing barons and angry peasants, but don't worry, I'll keep the pace slow enough to lull you off to sleep, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow the trail of one of the most famous most wanted royals of medieval England, King John, brother of Richard the Lionheart. He's the sort of monarch who manages to be despised in every chronicle you flip open. Contemporary monks called him greedy, cowardly, and vindictive, basically the medieval version of a Yelp review with 1 star. His reign from 1199 to 1216 left him in constant conflict. Not only with France but with his own barons. By 1215, his nobles had forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document historians still argue whether John ever intended to honor. Imagine a king so distrusted that his subjects essentially wrote the first terms and conditions agreement, with the threat of rebellion if he clicked decline. When John ignored those terms, because of course he did, rebellion flared up. By 1216, the rebels had even invited the French Prince Louis to invade England and take the throne. John found himself scurrying around his own kingdom, raising armies, losing castles, and watching his authority crumble. There's a quirky detail about him, too. Chroniclers claim he lost the royal treasure, including crown jewels, in quicksand while crossing the Wash estuary. You picture an embarrassed medieval search party, poking at the mud like kids trying to find a dropped phone. Some historians think this lost treasure story might have been propaganda, a way to show divine punishment for his sins. Others believe John really did miscalculate the tides and sank his baggage wagons into the marsh. Either way, it's an image that sticks, the King of England sinking his reputation in the mud. Both literally and metaphorically, fast forward a century, and you stumble into the drama of Edward II, another king who landed squarely on the most wanted list. Unlike his father, Edward I, known as the formidable Hammer of the Scots, Edward II earned nicknames more like the hammer who missed the nail entirely. His reign from 1307 to 1327 was plagued by military defeat, think disastrous losses against the Scots at Bannockburn, and favoritism toward courtiers who irritated the barons. That favoritism was his undoing. Nobles rebelled against him more than once, and his wife, Queen Isabella, eventually joined forces with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to overthrow him. Picture this, you're Edward. Once draped in purple robes, now reduced to sneaking between castles, your allies abandoning you one by one. In 1327, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. What happened after his deposition remains one of those chilling historical debates. Some sources claim he was murdered in captivity, famously with a red-hot poker, a detail historians still argue whether to trust or dismiss as gruesome rumor. Others suggest he may have lived on quietly, smuggled out of England to die in obscurity. The fact that scholars still can't agree makes Edward II the perfect bedtime figure, the king who may have haunted Europe in disguise, forever uncertain, forever wanted. Another royal who found himself hunted was Richard II. Grandson of Edward III, he began his reign in 1377 with a fair amount of promise. But Richard's sense of divine kingship turned increasingly tyrannical. He dismissed parliament, seized lands, and executed rivals, moves guaranteed to make barons plot behind tapestries. By 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, returned from exile with an army. Richard was cornered, captured, and ultimately forced to abdicate. Here's the quirky tidbit: when Richard was arrested. He supposedly gave up without a fight, remarking something like, "I am your king, yet you bring me down." It's almost Shakespearean, which makes sense because Shakespeare later dramatized Richard's tragic fall. But the historical record is hazy. Some chronicles suggest Richard died of starvation in captivity. Others whisper about secret plots and assassinations. Once again, historians argue whether Richard's fate was a straightforward imprisonment or something darker. Either way, Richard became a cautionary tale of royal arrogance leading to ruin. The thread tying John, Edward II, and Richard II together is the reminder that even kings could fall onto the medieval wanted list. You imagine their faces not on dusty parchment posters but maybe in today's terms, photoshopped into clickbait headlines, "You won't believe how this king lost his crown." Or "Royal fails, from castle to cell." Medieval politics had no patience for weak rulers, and a king who couldn't command loyalty quickly became the hunted instead of the hunter. As you drift further into this night story, you realize that the crown never guaranteed safety. Each monarch might have sat on a gilded throne, but in the flicker of rebellion, they were forced into flight, abandoned by their own guards, and sometimes stripped of dignity in the most humiliating ways. That's the uneasy heartbeat of medieval history. Even those with absolute power could become fugitives in their own kingdoms, their names echoing down tavern halls as cautionary tales. You're still walking, cloak damp from a drizzle that doesn't seem to let up, and the cobbled street gives way to a rougher road. You hear hoofbeats echoing in the distance, not the thundering charge of loyal cavalry, but the uneasy rhythm of knights who've abandoned honor for outlawry. These are the fugitive knights, men who once swore vows of chivalry yet found themselves hunted like wolves when those oaths shattered. Take William de Morisco, for example. You picture him in the 13th century, armor dulled by sea air, hiding on Lundy Island off the coast of Devon. He came from a noble family but was accused of treason against King Henry III. Rumors swirled that he plotted to assassinate the king. Though historians still argue whether this was fact or fabricated excuse to seize his land. What's certain is that William took up piracy, raiding ships and coastal villages, turning his island into a medieval crime hub. For 2 decades, royal forces failed to catch him. Imagine the frustration, the crown sending letter after letter to sheriffs, and William just sipping ale on Lundy, sharpening blades, watching the tide roll in. Eventually, Henry sent a serious fleet to storm the island. William was captured in 1242, dragged to London, and, this is the quirky part, executed in a manner meant to underline his treachery. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, then his remains displayed around the city. If there was a medieval most wanted poster, William's fate was its cautionary footnote. Then there's Sir Andrew Harclay, a knight who rose high but fell hard. He defended the north of England against the Scots in the early 1300s, even earning knighthood. But politics proved deadlier than swords. In 1323, Harclay negotiated a peace with Scotland without King Edward II permission. It might sound reasonable, who wouldn't want to stop bloodshed, but Edward saw it as treason. Harclay was arrested, stripped of his knighthood, and executed. Historians debate whether he was a traitor or just a practical man trying to prevent more loss of life. You can almost imagine Harclay muttering from the scaffold, "Seriously? I try to save everyone money on wars and this is my thanks." Sometimes knights turn fugitive for more personal reasons. Sir Adam de Gordon, a rebel knight during the baronial wars against Henry III, made his living raiding the Hampshire countryside. Chroniclers describe him as so formidable that Prince Edward, the future Edward I, personally rode out to fight him in single combat. Picture the scene, the prince and the outlaw knight clashing under the forest canopy. Steel ringing through the trees. According to legend, Edward bested Adam but spared his life, impressed by his courage. Adam was reinstated into favor, proving that sometimes being most wanted ended with a surprising pardon. It's one of those quirky tales where outlawry feels more like a sports rivalry than treason, but not every knight was redeemed. Sir Roger Mortimer, lover of Queen Isabella and partner in the overthrow of Edward II, had the temporary power of a kingmaker. Yet within a few years, his arrogance and greed turned him into England's most wanted man. In 1330, the young Edward III staged a daring coup at Nottingham Castle, sneaking through a secret tunnel to capture Mortimer. Imagine that, the mighty lord who had toppled a king dragged from his bed in the dead of night, hauled before Parliament, and executed for treason. Mortimer's story reminds you that outlaw knights weren't always swashbuckling heroes, they could be power-hungry schemers whose ambition outpaced their caution. Here's a fringe tidbit: medieval knights who went rogue often inspired ballads, the Spotify playlists of their day. Troubadours sang of outlaw warriors, sometimes polishing their reputations into something nobler than reality. That's why centuries later, you hear names like Robin Hood slipping into the mix. While historians still argue whether Robin Hood was a real outlaw knight or just folklore stitched together from various fugitives, the enduring legend shows how wanted men sometimes became beloved heroes. In bedtime terms, it's like history whispering a lullaby about lawbreakers who got a better PR team than their enemies. You keep trudging along that mental path, noticing how quickly loyalty curdled into betrayal. A knight swore allegiance to king, crown, and cross, but a moment of defiance, or just being on the wrong side of politics, could brand him a fugitive. The same mailed hands that once lifted banners of loyalty could clutch at the reins of a stolen horse, riding for the border under cover of darkness. The air feels heavier now, as though the ghosts of these fugitive knights are marching beside you, armor clinking softly. They remind you that the medieval world was never as stable as storybooks suggest. A knight could be a hero at dawn, a criminal by dusk, and a legend by bedtime. The road narrows into alleys where lamplight flickers and shadows stretch. Welcome to the world of assassins. The reason rulers slept with one eye open, forever wary of whispers in the dark. One of the most famous killings was in 1170, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, struck down by 4 knights after King Henry II muttered, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether calculated or careless, his words turned gripe into murder. Becket became a martyr, Henry did public penance, and the knights went down as villains. Not all assassins worked for kings. The Nizari Ismailis, dubbed assassins by Europeans, terrorized Persia and Syria with targeted killings. Chroniclers claimed they used hashish before missions, or lured recruits with visions of paradise to win obedience. Truth or rumor, their reputation fueled paranoia in courts where any servant might be a killer in disguise. Europe had its own. In 1478, the Pezzi family struck at the Medicis during High Mass in Florence Cathedral. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed to death, Lorenzo escaped, and within hours Florence erupted in revenge. Conspirators were hanged from windows, one even in archbishop's robes, shocking even hardened citizens. England, too, saw its spectacles. Hugh Despenser the Younger, Edward II's hated favorite, met one of the most elaborate public deaths in 1326, proof that sometimes erasure was meant to be unforgettable. Poison was another feared weapon. Chronicles accused Italian courts, especially the Borgias, of favoring the cup. Hidden rings dripping venom into wine became legend, a reminder that a banquet might be your last. Assassins left behind fear and rumor, whether as political tools, hired killers, or scapegoats. Power offered little shield against a blade in the dark. And as you drift further through this history, you almost feel a knife's edge, just a reminder that some of the darkest figures worked unseen, leaving only whispers behind. You leave the alleys behind and step into the salty wind of a harbor. Masts creak, ropes slap against beams, and somewhere a sailor curses in a dialect you barely catch. Tonight's fugitives aren't hiding in castles but drifting on the open sea, living by plunder and tide. These are the pirate lords, the most wanted men of medieval waters. Start with Eustace the monk, born around 1170, once a Benedictine before trading scripture for cutlass. Chroniclers claimed he dabbled in black magic and used trickery at sea, like decoy fires to lure ships. By the early 1200s, he was a mercenary pirate, switching sides between England and France. His end came at the Battle of Sandwich, 1217, when captured and beheaded. Some say he offered 10,000 marks for ransom, but revenge outweighed riches. North in Scotland, John of Islay, Lord of the Isles, blurred the line between noble and pirate. He commanded fleets that raided rivals and merchants, seen by kings as half outlaw, half ruler. Was he a defender of his lands or a seafaring criminal? Historians still argue. In the Baltic, the Vitalienbrüder, brothers, began as hired privateers in the 14th century, then turned pirate once their contract ended. They raided towns, struck Hanseatic ships, and set up bases on Gotland. Merchants dreaded their ragged fleets, yet legends credit them as early models for the pirate brotherhoods of lore. Further south, the Mediterranean teemed with corsairs and privateers. Genoa, Venice, and Barcelona thrived on commerce, but Catalan raiders and naval commanders like Bernat de Cabrera blurred war and piracy. Treaties tried to regulate ransom, but no parchment could calm the seas. Early Barbary pirates also appeared in the 13th to 14th centuries, raiding Europe from North Africa, so feared that villages built watchtowers as early warning. What stands out is how pirates were both hunted and hired. Monarchs condemned piracy, unless they needed it. Letters of marque turned criminals into privateers, but when wars ended, yesterday's ally became tomorrow's fugitive. Eustace's fate summed it up: prized when useful, executed when not. A quirky footnote: some pirates kept exotic pets, monkeys, parrots, even strange beasts from distant ports. Picture a grimy deck, sea spray flying, and a monkey screeching as swords clash. As you walk this harbor of memory, sails creaking overhead, you realize piracy wasn't marginal, it shaped economies and royal policy. Monarchs played endless whack-a-mole, stamping one pirate band only for another to rise. You can almost hear the sea now, rolling with the echoes of men forever caught between gold and the noose. You leave the salty harbor behind and step into the glow of firelight, not a cozy hearth, but a tribunal chamber, smoke curling from torches as stern faces judge you. This is the world of heretics, the most wanted thinkers of medieval Europe. Their crime wasn't robbery or revolt, but daring to believe, or say, something different. In an age where church and crown braided power, the wrong words could cut deeper than any blade. The Cathars in southern France were the most infamous. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they built a thriving movement rejecting Catholic orthodoxy, preaching that the material world was corrupt. Simple living and spiritual purity gave them wide appeal, but to the Church, they were a threat. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade. Cities burned, heretics fled, and the chilling phrase, "Kill them all, God will know his own," came to define the brutality, whether truly spoken or not. The Waldensians, founded by Peter Waldo, preached poverty in lay reading of scripture. Imagine peasants huddled in barns while priests thundered against them. Excommunicated and hunted, they survived underground, and still exist today. Ironically, Waldo may never have meant to start a movement, he simply gave away his wealth and preached, only to be branded a menace. Individual heretics became symbols. Jan Hus, inspired by John Wycliffe, railed against corruption and indulgences. Promised safe conduct, he was condemned instead, burned in 1415, his ashes scattered in the Rhine. His death sparked the Hussite Wars, turning a wanted preacher into a national rallying cry. Wycliffe himself, the morning star of the Reformation, translated the Bible into English so common people could read it. Declared a heretic, he died in 1384, but decades later the Council of Constance ordered his bones dug up and burned, a posthumous execution meant to erase him. Instead, his ideas spread like ashes on the wind. Trials often resembled grim theater, crowded halls, parchment accusations, a lone figure facing judges. Some recanted, others stood firm. Marguerite Porete, a mystic, was executed in 1310 for her book The Mirror of Simple Souls, which survived in whispers and later shaped mystical thought. Politics always loomed. A noble out of favor might suddenly be branded a heretic, while another was spared under protection. Was burning a preacher truly about faith, or about keeping bishops rich and kings secure? You glance around that smoky tribunal chamber, feeling the weight of every accusation. These heretics weren't armed with swords but with words, ideas, and books, and that was enough to make them hunted, wanted, feared. As you step back into the night air, you realize the most dangerous fugitives weren't hiding in forests, but in libraries. You leave the tribunal halls behind, smoke still lingering in your mind, and step into a royal palace, not to admire gilded rooms, but to notice the empty spaces. A missing prince, a vanished queen, a carriage slipping into the dark. These are runaway royals, fugitives who once sat on velvet cushions but found themselves on the most wanted lists. Take Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I. When her cousin Stephen seized the throne in 1135, England plunged into civil war. Matilda became a fugitive queen, slipping between castles, raising troops, always evading capture. Her most famous escape came in 1142, sneaking out of snowbound Oxford Castle in white cloaks to blend into the drifts. She never ruled England herself, but her son became Henry II, proof fugitives could still win in the long run. Then there's Isabella of France, the she-wolf. Neglected by Edward II, she allied with Roger Mortimer, raised an army, and invaded England in 1326. Capturing her husband, she forced his abdication and ruled through her son. But power shifted again. In 1330 Edward III executed Mortimer and pushed Isabella aside. Her story shows how a runaway could become conqueror, only to be hunted in turn. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, spent years fleeing during the Wars of the Roses. Fighting to protect her son's inheritance, she became the face of the Lancastrians, escaping battles and storms alike. After defeat at Tewkesbury in 1471, she was captured, later ransomed to France, and ended her days in obscurity, a queen reduced to exile. Across the Channel, the child Mary, Queen of Scots, was whisked to France in 1548 to escape English capture. At 6 years old, her life was already that of a fugitive, safe abroad, yet never truly free, always a pawn in dynastic games. Princes, too, sometimes ran. In 1470, Edward IV fled to Burgundy after defeat, sneaking aboard a ship like any exile. Within a year, he returned with reinforcements, reclaimed his throne, and executed his foes, the ultimate royal comeback. Chroniclers often told these tales with romantic flair. Matilda in her white cloak, Isabella marching with banners, Edward plotting in exile, these moments became legend. Royals were fugitives not despite their crowns, but because of them. And as you picture empty thrones in drafty halls, you grasp the irony. Sometimes the most wanted person in a kingdom was the one meant to rule it. You wander into the shadowed woods, where pine and damp earth drown out church bells. Here there are no gilded thrones, only boots, bows, and rough cloaks. This is the world of medieval outlaws, fugitives who defied sheriffs and lords, yet lived on in tavern songs more vividly than kings. We begin with Robin Hood. Was he real? Historians still argue. Early ballads paint him less as a charming hero and more a rough outlaw, quick with violence, robbing bishops and sheriffs rather than giving to the poor. Only later did the legend soften into the noble thief. Still, real or not, Robin embodied the people's dream, the most wanted man who fought for them. Others shared the greenwood. Ballads told of Adam Bell, Clym of the Clough, and William of Cloudesley, northern archers hunted through forests, surviving by bow and wit. Imagine them crouched in shadows as hooves thundered past, desperate men, yet admired for mocking authority. Some fugitives built kingdoms. Eustace the monk, once a Benedictine, turned pirate lord. He raided ships across the Channel, switching sides between England and France, donning disguises, even accused of storm conjuring. In 1217 he was captured and beheaded, his skull displayed, a monk turned terror of the seas. In Hungary, János Lipták, a noble turned outlaw, led highwaymen against caravans and castles. Authorities branded him menace. Peasants whispered his generosity, another echo of Robin Hood, far from Sherwood. And in Germany, the Roboter, or robber knights, extorted merchants from cliffside castles. Half noble, half bandit, they blurred warlord and criminal. Merchants cursed them, emperors outlawed them, but many endured for decades. Outlaws weren't just feared, they were sung about. Ballads of Robin Hood and local bandits rang in marketplaces despite bans, like a medieval tabloid culture with woodcut celebrity portraits. To live outside the law meant gallows or worse, yet memory lingers on the thrill of defiance. Robin eternal in the greenwood, Eustace conjuring storms, robber knights holding up emperors. Criminals to rulers, heroes to commoners. And as you leave the forest, mist clinging to the trees, you realize the most wanted men of the Middle Ages were also the ones people secretly cheered for. The forest fades behind you, and now you hear the echo of hoofbeats on cobblestones. Lanterns flicker against tall city walls, and you realize you've stepped into a different kind of manhunt. No longer the outlaws in the trees, but knights and warlords who became too ambitious for their own good. These are the traitorous nobles, lords once sworn to crown and kingdom who found themselves branded as most wanted when their ambition outweighed their loyalty. You remember Thomas Becket's killers, knights who obeyed their king and then faced infamy. But there were plenty of others who turned rebellion into a lifestyle. Take Roger Mortimer, lover of Isabella of France, the queen who helped depose Edward II. Mortimer wasn't just a scandalous consort, he was once the most wanted nobleman in England. Before he returned with Isabella, he had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for treason. In 1323, he pulled off a daring escape, drugging his guards and scaling down the tower walls. Imagine the most secure prison in the realm, and one noble climbing down ropes in the moonlight like a medieval action hero. He fled to France, became a fugitive, and then returned to England in glory. For a while, he ruled alongside Isabella, the real power behind the throne. But of course, such power painted a target on his back. By 1330, Edward III staged a coup, had him dragged from his bed, and executed him. Historians still argue whether Mortimer was truly a villain or simply too successful at playing the dangerous game of politics. Then there's Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. He lived in the 15th century during the Wars of the Roses, and for a while he was the most powerful man in England, powerful enough to crown and dethrone monarchs. Warwick first backed Edward IV to the throne but later turned against him, setting up Henry VI again before switching sides once more. His constant shifting made him both invaluable and untrustworthy. By 1470, when Edward IV regained power, Warwick was high on the most wanted list. He died in 1471 at the Battle of Barnet, but his legend as the ultimate traitorous noble stuck. A quirky tidbit. Chroniclers called him the last of the barons, as if his death marked the end of an era when lords could play kings like chess pieces. Of course, not all treacherous nobles ended up executed. Some lived long lives in exile, writing bitter letters about their betrayals. Consider the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, who in the 1470s sought to carve out his own independent kingdom between France and the Holy Roman Empire. His reckless wars brought him to ruin. And after his death, the Burgundian inheritance fell into Habsburg hands. While not always a fugitive himself, Charles left behind a cadre of disloyal lords, each scrambling for power and hunted by rivals. It's the constant medieval cycle: loyalty is conditional, rebellion is costly, and being most wanted was often just the next stage in a noble's career path. But one of the most infamous noble fugitives was Owain Glyndwr, the Welsh leader who declared himself Prince of Wales in 1400. For over a decade, he led a rebellion against English rule, capturing castles, rallying Welsh support, and even receiving recognition from France. Glyndwr was declared a traitor by the English crown. Hunted relentlessly across Wales. Yet he became a folk hero, and, here's the quirky tidbit, after his rebellion collapsed, he simply disappeared. No one knows exactly when or where he died. Historians still argue whether he lived out his last years in secret among loyal supporters, hidden in a remote farmhouse, or whether he slipped abroad. The fact that no one could ever prove his fate made him both most wanted and most elusive, a ghost haunting English kings for generations. There's a kind of irony in these noble fugitives. They had wealth, armies, castles, yet the moment they crossed their monarch, all that splendor turned into liability. Imagine Warwick, once cheered in London, now branded a traitor. Or Mortimer, sneaking down ropes from the tower, desperate as any thief. Nobles might have dressed in silks, but when hunted, they ended up looking much like any other fugitive, haggard, suspicious, one step from betrayal, and a fringe detail. Sometimes traitorous nobles were officially erased from chronicles, their names scratched out from official records. This medieval cancel culture was supposed to obliterate their memory, but in practice it often had the opposite effect. People remembered them more vividly, stories of their downfall whispered around fireplaces, their faces painted as villains in ballads. It's the historical equivalent of telling a child don't think about crocodile dung, and suddenly everyone can't stop picturing it, so you keep walking those cobblestones, listening to the hoofbeats echo off the walls, and you realize that the most wanted nobles weren't always the ones who lost. Sometimes, their names outlived the kings they betrayed. And you can almost hear them whisper from the shadows, better to be hunted and remembered than loyal and forgotten. The cobbled city fades behind you, and suddenly you're standing at the mouth of a fortress, banners snapping overhead, and the smell of wood smoke drifting down from the battlements. Siege towers loom, soldiers mill about, and you realize you've wandered into the world of rebellion leaders, the men and women who rallied entire regions into open defiance, often finding themselves topping the most wanted lists of kings and emperors. These weren't lone bandits in the woods, but entire armies moving under outlaw banners. Think first of Wat Tyler, leader of the English Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Imagine thousands of rebels storming into London, burning tax records, and demanding justice. They marched under makeshift banners, demanding an end to serfdom and unfair taxes. Tyler became the face of this fury, striding into negotiations with King Richard II. At Smithfield, he rode forward to speak with the king, only to be struck down in the middle of the meeting, slashed by the Lord Mayor of London. The rebels scattered soon after. Quirky tidbit. Chroniclers say the king, only 14 years old at the time, coolly rode into the panicked crowd and declared, "You have no leader but me." Historians still argue whether Tyler's death was an accident of temper or a planned assassination to cripple the revolt. Either way, the man who had once led thousands became a hunted corpse within minutes. Cross the Channel, and you meet Etienne Marcel, provost of the merchants in Paris during the 1350s. At the time, France was crushed by English invasions and economic collapse. Marcel rallied Parisians to demand reforms, turning against the crown. For a while, he controlled the capital itself, making him one of the most wanted men in France. But as power shifted, his enemies struck back. In 1358, Marcel was murdered by royalists at the city gate. A fringe tidbit. He supposedly carried keys to Paris in his belt when he died, a symbol of his temporary grip on the city. His rebellion collapsed overnight, but his name lingered, proof that even urban leaders could become fugitives when politics turned sour. Then there was William Wallace of Scotland. Yes, you probably picture Mel Gibson in blue face paint, but the real Wallace's story was harsher. After humiliating the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, Wallace became Scotland's most wanted hero. Edward I branded him a traitor, hunted him across the Highlands, and eventually captured him in 1305. His execution in London, hung, drawn, and quartered, was designed as a message: never again. Quirky tidbit. Before execution, Wallace was crowned with a garland of oak leaves, mocking him as the king of outlaws. Historians still argue whether Wallace fought mainly for national freedom or simply as another ambitious knight resisting English control. Either way, he remains the archetype of the rebel leader, defiant, doomed, unforgettable. Another Scottish name worth whispering is Robert the Bruce. Unlike Wallace, Bruce played the long game. In 1306, he stabbed his rival John Comyn inside a church, then proclaimed himself King of Scots. The English declared him an outlaw, Edward I raging that Bruce was more outlaw than king. For years, Bruce lived as a fugitive in caves and on remote islands, surviving ambushes and betrayals. Yet he rebuilt his forces, won the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and eventually secured Scotland's independence. The quirky part. One story says that while hiding in a cave, Bruce watched a spider try again and again to spin a web, failing several times before succeeding. Inspired, he kept fighting. Whether true or not, it's the coziest piece of motivational folklore to come from a man who spent years as the most wanted figure in Britain. And in Bohemia, there was Jan Žižka, the one-eyed general of the Hussites. After the execution of reformer Jan Hus in 1415, Žižka led radical followers into open war against the Holy Roman Empire. Blind in one eye and later in both, Žižka still commanded armies with brilliance, defeating crusader forces with wagon fort tactics. The Pope declared him an enemy, nobles cursed his name, yet his reputation spread across Europe as the rebel commander who could not be beaten. Quirky tidbit. His followers claimed he ordered his skin to be flayed after death and made into a war drum, so he could continue leading them in spirit. Historians still argue if that was myth or grisly exaggeration. But either way, Žižka turned outlaw rebellion into near-mythic triumph. The pattern becomes clear: rebellion leaders were wanted not just for their crimes but for what they symbolized. Tyler represented the fear of the masses rising up. Wallace represented the terror of conquered nations breaking free. Bruce embodied the nightmare of a fugitive king who actually won. And Žižka showed how religious revolt could upend entire empires. As you stand among those siege towers, you can almost hear the drumbeats of defiance, the clash of pikes against shields. Every leader you meet here is hunted, outlawed, cursed in proclamations. And yet, centuries later, their names feel louder than those of the kings who condemned them. The irony is sharp: the crown always won in the short term, but in the long hush of history, the most wanted rebels often outlived their hunters. You leave behind the rebel camps and smoking siege towers, stepping now into a quieter, more unsettling realm. The smell here isn't wood smoke but incense, heavy and cloying, seeping from cathedral doors. Candlelight flickers on stone walls, shadows stretch long, and you realize this is the hunting ground of the church itself. Here, the most wanted figures aren't kings or bandits, but heretics, those who dared to think differently about God, Scripture, and salvation in a world where theology was law. One of the most notorious was Peter Waldo of Lyon in the 12th century. A wealthy merchant, he gave away his fortune and began preaching a radical message of poverty and direct access to Scripture. His followers, the Waldensians, rejected the authority of priests, favoring lay preaching in the local tongue. To the church, this smelled of dangerous independence. Declared heretics, Waldo and his flock were hunted across France and Italy. Imagine small groups gathering in barns or caves, reading Scripture in secret, while inquisitors scoured villages for them. Quirky tidbit. The Waldensians survived underground for centuries, and later became forerunners of Protestantism. Historians still argue whether Waldo ever intended to break from Rome or simply underestimated how much independence the church could tolerate. Then there was Fra Dolcino in 14th century Italy. He and his followers, the Apostolics, preached communal living and rejection of church wealth. But unlike Waldo, Dolcino's group took a more militant turn. They roamed northern Italy, clashing with soldiers, living like apocalyptic nomads. Dolcino himself was branded a heretic, hunted, and finally captured in 1307. His execution was brutal, tortured and slowly killed in public. And yet, fringe detail, centuries later, Italian anarchists in the 19th century resurrected him as a kind of revolutionary hero. It's strange how a most wanted heretic can be recycled as a political mascot long after the fires of his pyre cooled, but perhaps the most famous medieval heretic was Jan Hus of Bohemia. Preaching in Prague in the early 15th century, Hus called for reforms, criticizing indulgences and the corruption of priests. His sermons attracted thousands, and soon he was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1415 under a promise of safe conduct. You can almost feel the tension, a reformer walking into a lion's den. He was arrested, tried, and burned at the stake. Quirky tidbit. When offered a chance to recant, Hus reportedly said, "Would not for a chapel full of gold." Historians still argue whether Hus's movement was purely religious or also fueled by Czech nationalism. Either way, his execution sparked the Hussite Wars, proof that silencing a heretic could backfire spectacularly. Another figure on the heretics' roll call is Marguerite Porete, a French mystic in the late 13th century. She wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical text describing a soul's union with God, beyond the mediation of the Church. That was too radical. Tried for heresy, she was burned in Paris in 1310. The quirky part? For centuries her book survived anonymously, passed around without her name attached. Only much later was she recognized as its author. It's a ghostly reminder of how hunted ideas can slip through cracks and survive even when their authors don't. You also think of the Cathars of southern France. A whole movement branded heretical in the 12th and 13th centuries. Believing in a dualist worldview, light versus dark, spirit versus matter, they rejected many church sacraments. The response was fierce, the Albigensian Crusade. Whole towns were massacred under the chilling order, "Kill them all, God will know his own." The Cathars became one of the largest collective groups on the most wanted list, their castles besieged, their people scattered. Historians still argue whether Cathar theology was coherent or whether it was exaggerated by their enemies, but the fact remains, they were hunted nearly to extinction, and yet, despite all this fire and fury, the stories of these heretics never quite went out. The Waldensians survived into modern times. Hus became a national hero in the Czech Republic. Marguerite Porete's mystical words still find readers. Even the Cathars, largely destroyed, live on in a kind of romanticized legend. Pilgrims still trek to Montségur, their last fortress, as if the ashes of their faith are still smoldering, the quirky fringe detail that sticks with you. Inquisitors sometimes complained in letters that burning heretics only made the crowds more sympathetic. People whispered about martyrs, kept relics of ashes, or scribbled down words to preserve them. The very act of making someone most wanted gave them a stage they might never have had otherwise, so you walk away from the cathedral's incense, leaving behind the smell of smoke from pyres. You realize that in the medieval world, to question the church was more dangerous than to rebel against a king. A king might forgive, the church never forgot. And as the bells toll in the distance, you feel the quiet shiver of that truth. Sometimes the most wanted people were not those who stole crowns or gold, but those who dared to speak aloud forbidden words. You step out from the shadow of burning pyres and into a more exotic realm, dusty roads, desert winds, and fortified cities shimmering under the sun. Here, the most wanted weren't kings or heretics in Europe, but raiders and corsairs from the edges of Christendom. They slipped across seas and borders, plundering towns, vanishing into the hills, and returning again like storms. To medieval rulers, they were nightmares personified, too mobile, too ruthless, and too clever to be caught easily. One of the most infamous names was Heretics Barbarossa, though his fame technically blossomed in the early 16th century, his roots belonged to the late medieval corsair world. He and his brother Auric began as privateers in the Mediterranean. Sanctioned at times by Ottoman rulers but branded as pirates by Christian kingdoms. Imagine brightly painted galleys darting out from North African harbors, their sails snapping, cannons booming, and crews swarming over merchant ships. Barbarossa became so notorious that European kings put a price on his head, branding him the most wanted man on the sea. Quirky tidbit. His nickname, Barbarossa, literally meant red beard, but originally it referred to his brother Auric. When Auric died, Heredin inherited both the legacy and the nickname, like some kind of piratical family brand. Historians still argue whether he was a pirate, a patriot, or simply a man who mastered the gray zone between. But corsairs weren't the only raiders. Along the English and French coasts, Norse-descended sea raiders, by then often labeled as pirates rather than Vikings, continued to plague towns well into the medieval period. They might sack a monastery one year and sign a treaty the next. These figures were hunted relentlessly by kings, but the sea made them slippery. Imagine a fugitive not hiding in a forest but vanishing into the endless horizon of the waves. Then there were land-based raiders who terrorized empires. In Spain during the Reconquista, bands of Moorish razzia raiders struck deep into Christian lands, seizing loot and prisoners before vanishing back across the frontier. To Christian chroniclers, they were the most wanted enemies imaginable, elusive, lightning fast, impossible to pin down. Quirky tidbit. Captives taken in these raids could sometimes ransom themselves back, so raiding wasn't just warfare, it was also a lucrative business model. Historians still argue whether some border skirmishes were more about economics than religion. Move east, and you encounter the Cuman and later the Tatar raiders sweeping into Eastern Europe. These horse archers seem to materialize out of the steppe, hit villages, then vanish back into the plains. Kings of Hungary, Poland, and Russia declared them enemies, but catching them was like trying to grab smoke. Chronicles describe villagers posting watchmen on hilltops to spot the dust clouds of approaching horsemen. Quirky tidbit. Some raiders were later hired as mercenaries by the very rulers who hunted them. It's a classic medieval contradiction. Today's most wanted outlaw could become tomorrow's ally if the pay was good enough. Closer to the Holy Land, during the Crusades, there were raiders like Reynaud de Chatillon, a French knight whose brutality earned him the title of one of the most hated men in the Muslim world. After becoming Lord of Ultra-Jordan, he repeatedly broke truces, raided caravans, and even threatened to attack Mecca itself. To Saladin, he was the ultimate most wanted Christian knight. And Saladin eventually got him. After the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Reynaud was captured. Quirky tidbit. Saladin personally executed him but spared the other captured nobles, as if to make an example out of the one man who had overstepped every boundary. Historians still argue whether Reynaud was simply reckless or deliberately trying to spark war. Either way, he played his role as outlaw lord to perfection, right up until his end, and let's not forget the Barbary corsairs who haunted European coasts, particularly after the fall of Granada in 1492. Though spilling slightly past the medieval into early modern waters, their roots grew from centuries of Muslim-Christian frontier warfare. Villages in Italy, Spain, and even as far north as Ireland dreaded the sudden appearance of strange sails. One fringe detail. Entire coastal communities moved inland, abandoning the sea altogether, simply because corsairs made them feel like prey in their own homes. As you picture these raiders, the sea captains with scarred faces, the horsemen galloping with bows drawn, the lords who treated truces like suggestions, you realize that being most wanted often meant being too fast to catch. Unlike traitorous nobles or heretics nailed to their stakes, raiders lived on the edge, thriving precisely because kings couldn't pin them down. The sea, the steppe, the desert, all became their hiding places. And you can almost hear the echo of waves against wooden hulls or the thunder of hooves across open fields. These fugitives weren't just criminals, they were storms, remembered long after their sails sank and their hoofprints faded. You leave behind the salt-stung air of raiders and corsairs and step into darker alleys, places where whispers spread faster than swords, and fear wasn't about pirates at sea but about strangers who moved among townsfolk, hidden and unseen. Here, the most wanted weren't kings or warriors but killers, poisoners, and assassins, pursued less by armies and more by rumor, suspicion, and sheer terror. Take the case of medieval assassins, literally the Nizari Ismaili sect, whose reputation spread across the Middle East and into Europe. From their mountain stronghold of Alamut, they carried out targeted killings of powerful enemies. The Crusaders called them assassins, supposedly because they smoked hashish. Though modern historians argue that detail is probably slander invented by their enemies. Still, their reputation was chilling, men who could infiltrate courts, blend into crowds, and then strike at the heart of power. To Christian knights and Muslim sultans alike, they were the most wanted shadows, too dangerous to ignore. Quirky tidbit. Marco Polo claimed they trained recruits in fake gardens of paradise, drugging them and convincing them they had glimpsed heaven, so they would gladly die for their masters. Historians still debate whether this was truth or just exotic traveler's myth, but the legend itself made the assassins all the more terrifying. Move westward and you find the quiet but no less sinister world of poisoners. In Italy, whispers spread of women selling powders that could kill slowly and discreetly. Authorities hunted them relentlessly because their crimes were invisible: no sword, no dagger, just a pinch of dust and wine. Some chronicles tell of noblemen who feared their wives' kitchens more than enemy battlegrounds. Quirky tidbit. The Council of Ten in Venice reportedly kept secret files on suspected poisoners, and trials were whispered about but rarely made public, because the very idea of poison suggested corruption at the highest levels. Historians still argue how widespread poisoning really was or whether many of these accusations were just political smear campaigns. Then there were infamous serial killers, though the term serial killer is modern. Medieval Europe had its monsters. Gilles de Rais, for example, was a French noble and former companion in arms to Joan of Arc. After her death, rumors began to swirl: missing children near his estates, strange rituals, grotesque spectacles. By 1440, he was put on trial for the abduction, abuse, and murder of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children. He was burned at the stake, officially branded one of the most wanted men of his age. Quirky tidbit. Some revisionist historians have argued Gilles de Rais may have been framed, his confession extracted under torture, his wealth too tempting for the crown to ignore. Others insist the horrors were real, pointing to consistent witness accounts. To this day, he hovers uneasily between medieval bogeyman and political victim. In England, chronicles mention men like Sawney Bean, though his story is probably folklore more than fact. According to legend, Sawney led a clan of cannibals in Scotland, ambushing travelers and living off their flesh in a hidden cave. Whether true or not, he was branded the most wanted outlaw of imagination, a figure who terrified villagers not because of politics, but because of the primal fear that you could vanish on the road and never return. Historians argue he never existed, that his legend was propaganda designed to paint Scots as savage during English rule. Still, the story lived on, proof that Most Wanted could be as much about fear as fact. Meanwhile, in the German lands, stories of the werewolf of Bedburg circulated in the late 16th century but drew on much older medieval fears. Peter Stump, accused of witchcraft and lycanthropy, was executed gruesomely after allegedly confessing to dozens of murders. Was he truly a killer, or just another victim of witch panic? Either way, he became the face of the monstrous outlaw, wanted not just for crimes but for supposedly embodying the devil's power. Quirky tidbit. His supposed werewolf belt, given to him by Satan, was said to let him transform at will. Historians generally dismiss this as fantasy, but it shows how medieval justice blurred into myth. And then, there were the nameless killers. Bandits turned murderers who preyed on isolated hamlets, their names forgotten but their terrors preserved in chronicles. A murdered pilgrim here, a butchered merchant there, tiny notes in abbots' records that suggest the roads were haunted not only by robbers but by predators far darker. Most were never caught, never punished, their faces unknown, making them the truest Most Wanted, the unseen, the uncatchable. As you imagine these figures, daggers flashing in courts, powder slipping into goblets, children lured away into castles or caves, you realize the medieval world feared not only the raider who struck openly but also the predator who lurked unseen. These Most Wanted were ghosts among the living. And their shadows still chill you, centuries later. The chill of shadowy killers lingers, but your path drifts back into sunlight and the clamor of bustling markets, where word of coin and contracts hangs heavier than incense in the church air. You realize that not all medieval most wanted stories were just about desperate outlaws hiding in woods or nobles falling from grace. Some fugitives had entire industries built around their capture. Enter the bounty hunters, the trackers, mercenaries, and opportunists who made their living turning flesh and freedom into jingling pouches of silver. It's tempting to imagine them as medieval versions of action movie cowboys, but in reality, most bounty hunting was more bureaucratic. Across much of Europe, royal courts issued letters of outlawry, formally declaring that a person no longer had the king's protection. Once outlawed, anyone could kill you without penalty. But it was more profitable to drag you in alive, and so professional trackers took up the chase. Quirky tidbit. In 13th century England, villages were legally bound to form a hue and cry whenever a crime occurred, basically, your neighbors sprinting after the thief with pitchforks and dogs. Historians still argue whether this communal manhunt was effective or just gave everyone free cardio. The true specialists, however, often operated in the gray spaces of law. In France, some bounty hunters were hired by sheriffs to track deserters or bandits across borders. They'd rely on knowledge of forests, taverns, and even pilgrim hostels where fugitives might hide among holy travelers. If you'd ever wondered what medieval LinkedIn looked like, it was probably tavern gossip about who knew the best shortcut through a marsh to catch a runaway knight. One of the most famous hunts involved William Wallace, yes, the Braveheart himself. To the English crown, Wallace wasn't a freedom fighter but the most wanted man in Scotland, and huge rewards were promised for his capture. In 1305, bounty hunters, or rather, turncoat allies, delivered him to Edward I. His fate was brutal, but the idea stands. Rebellion often ended not with grand battles but with betrayal purchased in coin. Then there were the professional thief-takers of London, who rose in the late medieval period and flourished into the early modern age. Before police forces existed, these men hunted criminals for reward money. Some were honest enough, others were notoriously corrupt, staging robberies just so they could heroically catch the culprit. Quirky tidbit. A few thief-takers doubled as highwaymen at night. Talk about conflict of interest. Historians still debate whether thief-takers reduced crime or simply added a new species of criminal to the ecosystem. The world of bounty hunting stretched beyond Europe. In the Mongol Empire, fugitives had almost no chance. The Great Khan's messengers spread news of outlaws across thousands of miles, and loyal steppe riders were essentially living bounty hunters. The empire's communications system, the YAM, allowed riders to swap horses at outposts and pursue quarry across vast distances. Imagine being wanted in the 13th century and realizing that a note about your face was galloping ahead of you on the world's fastest courier network. You'd probably just sit down and wait for the horseman to arrive. Religious authorities also employed bounty-like systems. The Inquisition often relied on informants, offering spiritual rewards, or financial ones, for those who betrayed heretics. In this context, bounty hunting blurred into espionage, with neighbors denouncing neighbors. A chilling thought, your best friend could cash you in like a sack of silver if your sermon strayed too far from orthodoxy. In Italy, mercenary captains sometimes moonlighted as fugitive catchers, hired by cities to retrieve enemies of the state. These condottieri were skilled in siege and battle, but a single outlawed banker or rebel leader could be worth as much as a small fortress. Quirky tidbit. Some records show bounties phrased not just in money but in livestock, fine clothes, or even barrels of wine. Imagine risking your life to capture a thief and being paid in goats, functional, but not exactly a Netflix-worthy ending. What made bounty hunting thrive was the blend of desperation and opportunity. For peasants, capturing a local outlaw might mean never worrying about taxes again. For lords, paying a hunter to return a fugitive knight preserved dignity without wasting troops. And for the outlaws, knowing bounty hunters were on their trail meant a life of sleepless nights. never quite daring to stay in the same place twice. You walk through this world of contracts and coin, hearing the echo of boots behind you, the rattle of shackles carried in a sack. The medieval most wanted weren't just feared for their crimes, they were coveted as rewards, commodities with prices on their heads. And the hunters chasing them blurred lines between justice and greed, making every capture as much about business as it was about law. You shake the dust of bounty hunting from your cloak and slip quietly into the hushed corridors of courts, places where the true game of cat and mouse was often invisible. The medieval world wasn't just filled with outlaws, pirates, and killers, it was alive with spies, foreign agents slipping across borders with secrets tucked under their cloaks. These figures, sometimes celebrated as diplomats but just as often hunted as traitors, were among the most wanted people of their age, though their faces were rarely known to the common folk. Picture a medieval court, torches flickering against painted walls, murmurs of foreign envoys, the rustle of scrolls sealed with wax. Behind the polite smiles, every ambassador could just as easily be a spy. Monarchs knew it, and so every arrival from another land came wrapped in suspicion. Quirky tidbit: medieval kings sometimes intentionally placed their foreign guests in drafty, uncomfortable quarters, hoping the cold would loosen tongues or hasten mistakes. Historians still argue whether such tricks actually worked or just made visitors grumpier at breakfast. One of the most infamous cases of espionage was during the 100 Years' War. Both the English and the French employed networks of spies to sniff out troop movements and whisper campaigns. Joan of Arc herself was accused by her enemies not only of heresy but of acting as a secret agent of France's king. To the English, she was not just a holy woman but a dangerous, most wanted spy whose very existence threatened their military strategy. Her capture and trial show how espionage could blur into accusations of witchcraft, treason, or both. The Byzantine Empire, ever fond of intrigue, practically professionalized spying. They used a network of agents called the Bureau of Barbarians, a name that sounds like a heavy metal band but was essentially their foreign intelligence service. Their task was to monitor envoys, collect gossip, and pass intelligence back to Constantinople. Quirky tidbit: Byzantines were known to lace wine with soporific herbs during diplomatic banquets, ensuring their guests spoke a little too freely. Historians still debate how effective these tricks were or whether they're simply exaggerated tales told by later chroniclers. In the Islamic world, spies were crucial during both the Crusades and in the sprawling Abbasid Caliphate. The caliphs employed agents called barid, part postmen, part informants, who ensured that rulers were always one step ahead of conspiracies. To be caught as a spy here was fatal. You weren't just an enemy, you were dishonorable. And execution was usually swift. Imagine sneaking through Damascus with coded letters stitched into your cloak, every alley a potential end. You were quite literally living as one of the most wanted. Meanwhile, in the tangled politics of Italy's city-states, espionage reached Shakespearean levels. Venice in particular became infamous for its secretive Council of Ten, which orchestrated assassinations and gathered intelligence through an elaborate network of spies. They even had special denunciation boxes, stone mouths where citizens could anonymously drop notes accusing neighbors of treason. Quirky tidbit: some of these notes were totally absurd, like accusing someone of witchcraft because their chickens laid oddly shaped eggs. Historians still argue whether Venice's spy system truly safeguarded the city or simply sowed paranoia in every piazza. Then there were the spies who weren't foreign at all but homegrown traitors, men and women bribed to betray their own lords. The Wars of the Roses in England, for instance, were practically fueled by espionage. Secret letters were hidden in hollowed-out books, rings carried coded messages, and defectors switched sides mid-battle after being promised safety or gold. A single spy, well-placed, could decide a war, and such figures instantly became the most wanted people in the kingdom. Occasionally, espionage had a comedic streak. Some chronicles describe bumbling spies who were caught almost immediately, like the man in Flanders who tried to sneak into a castle disguised as a washerwoman, only to be betrayed by his rather unconvincing beard stubble. Quirky detail: but it shows how dangerous and ridiculous spycraft could be in equal measure, but not all spies were executed. Sometimes, captured agents were too valuable to kill. Monarchs would imprison them instead, interrogating them for months, trying to flip them into double agents. The practice of turning spies is not just modern. It stretches deep into the medieval world. After all, who better to spy for you than someone already skilled at betrayal? As you drift deeper into this world of shadows, you feel the paranoia settling like a draft in a great hall. In every corner, someone whispers too much, someone lingers too long, someone carries a letter a little too carefully. Spies were the most wanted not because they wielded swords or plundered ships, but because they carried the invisible weapons of information, and in a medieval world balanced precariously on rumor and power, information was deadlier than steel. The corridors of espionage give way to a softer path now, where the line between outlaw and legend begins to blur. You find yourself walking not through courts or dungeons but through taverns, meadows, and fireside stories where voices rise to retell the deeds of figures who were once hunted, yet somehow outlived their pursuers by slipping into myth. These are the criminals who became folk heroes, the most wanted who, against all odds, transformed into the most remembered. Robin Hood is the obvious name, of course. In the medieval imagination, he was the green-clad outlaw hiding in Sherwood Forest, robbing from the rich to give to the poor. Historically, it's murky. There may have been several men named Robert Hood or similar. Petty criminals whose deeds were exaggerated. Historians still argue whether Robin was ever real, a composite of many outlaws, or pure invention. But by the 14th century, his ballad spread widely, and to common folk, he was no criminal but a savior in an unjust world. Quirky tidbit. Early Robin Hood stories didn't feature Maid Marian at all. She was a much later addition, possibly borrowed from May Day festivals. It seems even outlaws need a little romance added for dramatic flair. He wasn't alone. Fulk Fitzwarren, a real 12th century English knight, rebelled against King John and lived as an outlaw for years. Instead of being erased, his adventures were romanticized into a popular tale that painted him as a righteous rebel. In truth, he was a wanted man, chased across the Welsh marches, but in the retellings, he became a folk hero standing tall against tyranny. Across the Channel, French peasants sang about Eustace the monk, a mercenary, pirate, and occasional sorcerer who fought for both the French and English before being executed. He was a wanted man on both sides, yet the chansons about him made him larger than life. Quirky tidbit. Some tales claimed he could turn invisible or disguise himself as animals to escape capture. Historians still debate whether these were sincere beliefs or just medieval audiences enjoying some spicy exaggeration. In Germany, the tales of noble bandits, like the Roboter, blended crime with glamour. Though they extorted tolls and robbed travelers, songs often painted them as daring and defiant rather than brutish. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, the Hajduks, outlaw bands who resisted Ottoman authority, were celebrated as heroes by local peasants. Even while being hunted relentlessly, these legendary criminals lived on not because they survived their manhunts, but because common folk wanted them to. In an age of taxes, tithes, and endless wars, the outlaw who defied kings or bishops became a symbol of freedom. Balladeers polished their rough edges, minstrels strummed their names into eternity, and suddenly the most wanted were the most beloved. As you walk further, the clamor of hunts and the clang of swords fade into the hum of a lute, the murmur of voices sharing tales. The outlaws are no longer dangerous but dreamlike, their faces flickering in firelight, their crimes softened into jokes, their punishments blurred into heroic sacrifices. You realize that history often hunts people down, but memory sometimes sets them free, and now, with the last embers of these tales glowing faintly, you let the noise of pursuit fade entirely. The galloping horses, the rattling chains, the clamor of courts. They dissolve into silence, leaving only the soft rhythm of your own breath. The most wanted men and women of the medieval world are long gone, their names little more than echoes, their faces shadows on parchment. The forests where outlaws once hid are quiet now, trees sighing gently in the night breeze. The castles where spies whispered their secrets are just stones, moss-covered and crumbling, their grandeur softened by time. Even the seas once churned by pirate ships are calm, waves lapping against shores that have forgotten the names of those who ruled them. You picture the outlaw ballads sung softly by firelight, not as tales of fear but of comfort, a reminder that even in a harsh world, people dreamed of freedom and justice. That dream is what endures, not the chains, not the gallows, not the hunting horns, so let your mind ease now, tracing no more footsteps through shadowed forests or echoing halls. You don't need to chase or be chased. You don't need to remember every name or crime. Just let the images drift, green woods, soft lutes, the gentle hush of voices fading like mist, your breathing slows. Your shoulders loosen. The most wanted of the past vanish into stories, and those stories, too, dissolve into quiet. What remains is only calm, steady, timeless. Rest now, knowing history will keep its own watch. You are safe, the night is long, and sleep is waiting, patient and warm.